Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'm going to talk about 8 myths we see with panic attacks. So these are common myths that I have heard over the years when learning about panic attacks, treating panic attacks. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So a panic attack is a period of intense fear, anxiety, and worry that also has physical symptoms associated with it, like increased heart rate, trembling, dizziness, sweating. So panic attacks are clearly distressing, and it's understandable why there's a lot of information and advice about panic attacks. People want to find a way to successfully treat them and to understand them. However, as I mentioned, there are myths out there. So let's start with myth number 1. Myth number 1 is if you have panic attacks, you have panic disorder. Panic attacks are a symptom of a number of mental health disorders, and in and of themselves don't represent a mental health disorder. There is no panic attack disorder. Yes, panic disorder is one of the disorders that has panic attacks associated with it, and it's one of the ones we think of early on. If we hear the term panic attack, we oftentimes think of panic disorder. But also we see panic attacks in social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, as well as a number of other mental health disorders. Panic attacks are a symptom of a number of disorders, but again, they're not a disorder. So if you have panic attacks, you may have panic disorder, or you may have a variety of other mental health disorders, or you may not have a mental health disorder at all. Myth number 2 is that panic attacks lead to a psychotic disorder. So there's a fear with panic attacks that's understandable that they must be indicative of something more serious. And it doesn't help that during panic attacks some people experience depersonalization and derealization, and we even hear presentations where there are sometimes auditory and visual hallucinations. And of course that would technically qualify as psychosis, the hallucination part. But a disorder characterized by psychosis is much different than a lot of the disorders that have panic attacks as a feature. But there is comorbidity, meaning a person oftentimes will have more than one mental health disorder. So while panic attacks don't lead to any type of psychotic disorder, sometimes panic attack symptoms can occur at the same time as psychosis caused by another mental health disorder. So there's more evidence that leads to this fear, but it's really multiple disorders. We really have to interpret that evidence carefully. It's not the panic attacks that are causing a type of psychotic disorder. Myth number 3 is that you can avoid panic attacks by avoiding triggers. Now this is a bit of a tricky myth because with social anxiety disorder, for example, generally you can avoid some panic attacks by avoiding triggers. But with panic disorder, the panic attacks are unexpected and there is no real trigger. The trigger would be worrying about another panic attack. Somebody panics because they're worried they're going to have another panic attack. And sometimes they're just out of the blue, as I mentioned. So this myth is not as clear-cut. In general, though, we usually think of it as a bad idea to make a concerted effort to avoid triggers. Now, in the short run, it makes sense to avoid some triggers, to avoid panic attacks and specific situations. But in the long run, avoiding triggers restricts someone's life. It blocks off more and more activities that they can participate in. It's not necessarily a good strategy to try to avoid panic attacks by avoiding triggers. Myth number 4 is that panic attacks can cause somebody to lose control. And I've heard many versions of this myth. A panic attack, of course, has the fight, flight, or freeze response. One of those, or sometimes more than one, will occur during the course of a panic attack. So there's this fear during a panic attack that somebody could lash out, that they could have the fight response, or they could just lose control altogether and really not understand where they are, not understand what's going on, stumble over people trying to get out of a room, something like that, really embarrassing themselves, drawing a lot of attention to themselves. This is actually quite rare. Generally, panic attacks don't cause somebody to be aggressive or violent or lose control in any way. Myth number 5 is that panic attacks can cause fainting or passing out. Only very rarely is this the case. Generally, panic attacks really work in the other direction. Somebody would be more ramped up. They'd have an increased heart rate and be ready for more activity rather than being set up to faint or pass out. Occasionally, we see this, I mentioned a rare occasion, but generally panic attacks are not associated with fainting. Myth number 6 is that panic attacks can last for hours. Normally, we see panic attacks reach their peak in about 5 to 10 minutes, and then they start subsiding. Now, the effects of panic attacks can certainly be felt for hours. Usually, somebody will feel anxious, drained physically, tired after a panic attack. But the actual period of intense fear and the physical symptoms, as I mentioned, usually peaks in about 5 to 10 minutes and then starts to improve over the next few minutes. So panic attacks may seem like they go on for a long time, but actually it's only a few minutes. Myth number 7 is that breathing techniques don't help. So breathing has an interesting relationship with panic attacks. A lot of times we hear the advice with panic attacks that somebody should take deep breaths. This is actually usually a bad idea. See, when we think of panic attacks, one of the concerns is hyperventilation. But hyperventilation doesn't really have anything to do with getting too little oxygen. It has to do with having too little carbon dioxide. So deep breathing will actually lower the amount of carbon dioxide and could make a panic attack a bit worse. That doesn't mean that breathing techniques are a bad idea or don't help. They do help. The kind of breathing that helps normally during a panic attack is normal breathing. Breathing slowly, at a measured pace, in a controlled way. Not taking deep breaths, not pulling in air too quickly or too deeply, and not exhaling too quickly. So breathing techniques, I think, are actually a major part of coping with panic attacks. Once somebody learns how to breathe in a helpful way during a panic attack, that's a major milestone, usually, in treatment, because it's an important tool that can be used over and over to reduce the duration and severity of panic attacks. And eventually, it can even reduce the frequency. That's because the skill of breathing in a helpful way is available to a person and the anxiety is reduced. They know that they can better cope with a panic attack if it does happen. So that frequency, the frequency of the panic attacks, can actually go down. Myth number 8 is that panic attacks can't be treated. Now, as I mentioned earlier, panic attacks are a symptom of a mental health disorder, potentially more than one mental health disorder, or some of the panic attacks could have no mental health disorders. So the treatment effectiveness of panic attacks really depends on what mental health disorders, if any, are operating, and what symptoms of those mental health disorders are being addressed in treatment. Even though panic attacks are extremely distressing, they're not always the priority for a client receiving treatment with a mental health disorder that could lead to panic attacks. It could be generalized anxiety, depression, flashbacks, obsessions, compulsions. There could be a lot of areas that can be focused on as a priority for treatment and not the panic attacks. So panic attacks can be treated, but in terms of how effective treatment is, it really depends on the prioritization, what mental health disorders might be there, and each individual is different. Individuals come into treatment with different levels of frequency, severity, and duration of panic attacks. So this is a myth. Panic attacks can be treated, but it's important to recognize there are a lot of variables that influence the effectiveness of that treatment. I hope you found these 8 myths of panic attacks to be interesting. Thanks for watching.